We live in polarized times when the very idea of something progressive getting passed through our divided state government seems laughable, let alone our gridlocked federal government. But that's exactly what happened right here in our beloved Washington state in November 2012, when voters passed Initiative 512 allowing the sale of recreational marijuana within our state's borders. I think anyone who's been paying any attention would give huge credit to Hempfest for aiding in the passage of that initiative. Originally billed in 1991 as the Washington Hemp Expo, the first Hemp Fest started in Volunteer Park with a meager attendance of only 500 people and a staff that consisted of 20 members of the Seattle Peace Heathens Community Action Group. Do we have any of those original 20 among us today? No? All right, well.
We're just not raising their hands.
Yeah, right. We have with us today the Executive Director of Hempfest, Vivian McPeak, discussing his recently released book, Protestival, a 20-year retrospective of Seattle Hempfest. The book chronicles the history of the groundbreaking and controversial Protestival. So this should be a good one. Please join me in welcoming Vivian McPeak.
Thanks, Tim. If, I thought someday they might throw the book at me, so I decided I'd give them a book to throw at me. It's really memorable. First of all, thank you so much for coming on this first beautiful day in a long time. It's really memorable for me to be here because the Seattle Peace Heathens really started right across the street when Tower Records used to be directly across the street. And in 1987, we started hitting the Ave, trying to do positive things in the name of the counterculture. And I think around 89, we started doing a free table across the street, right between the two, right in that wall area between the two windows. And we had a Peace Heathens free table there for 3 summers, giving away free food. We made sandwiches right there. We had Starbucks coffee for free, which didn't make Nordstrom's very happy because they were selling coffee in there. And we had free condoms and AIDS information and crisis guides and toilet paper for homeless people and toothbrushes and clothing and all kinds of stuff. And we gave all this stuff away for free for 3 summers out there until, I don't know how we lasted for 3 summers. But we had a huge presence on the Ave. We were a university district-based organization, volunteer group. And so it's really memorable for me to be here 25 years later on the other side of the street doing this. I am going to read some of the earlier chapters, which I think are the more interesting chapters in the book Protestival. There's no C in Protestival, just so you know. So I'm going to start off with a prologue, and then I'll read a couple of the first chapters. I do want to say that there's 180 photos in Protestival. The vast majority were taken by Tony Lilly, who's sitting right here. Help set this up. There's 160 pages. There's 20 chapters. Every chapter is a year. Every chapter starts with a full-page picture of the poster from that year. So I'm going to start with the prologue. In times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. George Orwell. Hey, bro, how's it going? It was hard to make out his words. His speaking often sounded slurred, as if he'd had too many martinis at the company party. I ambled across the hardwood floor, taking in the afternoon. The sunlight streaked through the large bay windows next to the hospital bed in his living room. Once an active man, Freddie had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in the 1980s when he was driving cab. For a while, he was able to work with his illness, but there came a time when Freddie went to pick up patients from the hospital who had an easier time getting in and out of his cab than he did. "Would you light the pipe for me?" he asked. I fumbled with the lighter at first, but as I got it positioned just right, Freddie took a long, slow drag on the small glass pipe. He leaned his head back, letting out a long sigh as he exhaled. "Relief, bro. This gives me relief." We sat in silence for a few minutes. I had met Freddie and his wife Annie a few years earlier, and I watched Freddie's health decline as his illness progressed. When I first met them, Freddie was wheelchair-bound, but he was essentially independent as long as he stayed on the ground floor of their modest, well-kept home in the Seattle suburb of Burien. Freddie's wife Annie was an attractive woman, slim with dark black hair cropped in a pageboy bob. She had full lips, a great smile, and deep brown eyes. She struggled to care for her husband. He was a large man, and he was now unable to do anything for himself. I was struck by her loyalty and dedication. She could have easily hooked up with some other guy, but Annie diligently stayed and cared for her man. She never complained and was always upbeat and positive in Freddie's presence. She would do anything it took to make his last days as free from suffering as possible. The only thing that helped Freddie manage the tremors and the pain from his condition was marijuana. Annie worked odd jobs, but Freddie's disability checks were their principal income. Not able to afford as much cannabis as Freddie needed to quell his suffering, Annie eventually installed a modest grow room in the basement of their home. Every 3 months or so, she would laboriously harvest and trim Freddie's homegrown medicine. Life was very difficult, but they got by without incident for years. Freddie would get sick and they would have a scare, but he always bounced back. After several years, Freddie grew much worse. I'd come over to visit him, but I could no longer understand anything my old friend was saying to me. Nor could Freddie hold the pipe for himself anymore. He was paralyzed and confined to his bed. Annie had placed a full-screen TV above for him to watch, and he would fumble to negotiate the remote, the last bit of control he had over his life, which was clearly wasting away. He was in there, his mind was sharp as a tack, but his body was no longer cooperating with him in any way. It was heartbreaking to watch. He had a beautiful wife, a wonderful home, and he was slowly being consumed by his disease. One day Annie had to run to the store for some groceries. She often had to dart out of the house for 15 minutes or so, knowing that Freddie would be fine in his bed, his television blaring. However, this day would be different. Shortly after Annie left the house, it was raided by the local narcotics task force. As Freddie lay helpless in his bed, unable to speak, strangers walked back and forth throughout his home. He could hear the officers downstairs in his basement tearing out wiring and cutting the cords to his lights. One by one, he watched as officers came up from the basement carrying the green medicine that Annie had tended so religiously, purely out of love for her man, for her Romeo, who had been so unkindly stricken before they had a chance to fulfill their dreams. When Annie came home, she was met by law enforcement. They had removed the plants, the lights, and the ballasts. When she eventually made it downstairs after the invaders had left, she was shocked to discover they had cut a hose leading into her basement without turning off the water, and the basement had completely flooded. Freddie was removed from the home before Annie had returned. She had just run to the store, but because there was nobody at home at the time, the authorities decided that Freddie was in danger. Freddie died about 2 weeks later, his frail body unable to endure the stress of their home invasion. This all happened before there was a medical marijuana law passed in Washington state. I was absolutely blown away that someone in Freddie's condition could be treated as inhumanely when all he was doing was trying to lessen his suffering with the wondrous powers of marijuana used, as it had been, for millennia as medicine. Freddie and Annie's story is one of too many from within the Hempfest community that demonstrate the suffering caused by prohibition. Sadly, despite the will of the voters of Washington state, qualified medical marijuana patients are still being mistreated because of cannabis prohibition. This book chronicles the Seattle Hempfest and the efforts we've made over the years to see that all Americans have the freedom to benefit from quality hemp products and to choose to use cannabis if they so desire. Now I'm going to back up to the introduction. If we had told anybody during the spring of 1991 that we were going to place a marijuana rally in one of Seattle's most beautiful waterfront parks, fill it with a few 100,000 pot enthusiasts, staff it with volunteers, and that bands and speakers would come from all over the nation to participate while the police looked on, well, they would have thought we were crazy. That's what a ragtag assembly of community volunteers has accomplished over 20 years of steady organizing, the result of hundreds upon hundreds of planning meetings, and rooted firmly in the spirit of volunteerism. The Seattle Hempfest has endured 2 decades to be recognized as one of the flagship events of the global cannabis culture. This book is an overview from my perspective of some of the high points of that 20-year endeavor. Hempfest has been made possible because of a huge community of individuals who have at one time or another expended energy and made sacrifices necessary for it to happen. There have been thousands of people who've made substantial contributions to the event, the organization, and the community. These folks have been the wind in Hempfest sails. I want to take this opportunity to honor and to thank each and every Hempfest volunteer who's participated in any of the Seattle Hempfest of the past. I'm not aware of a more grassroots event, and the sheer number of volunteer hours it was taken to bring the Hempfest's message of freedom and personal responsibility to the world is just staggering. Many people in the Hempfest organization have sacrificed personal time with friends and family, absorbed out-of-pocket expenses, and have contributed to the cause above and beyond the call of duty. While it's uncertain how much longer Hempfest can remain an all-volunteer organization, volunteerism has made this political and cultural phenomenon possible. It is purely in the spirit of community service that this great endeavor has occurred, and I hope that Hempfest can serve as an inspiration for others to participate in community volunteerism. I feel there's no greater act than that which is intended to improve the lives of others. Every task completed, and every Hempfest produced has been in total solidarity with the thousands of activists in the global cannabis liberation movement. Our beautiful culture has been in part created by prohibition, which serves to support the notion that something good comes out of everything. My reward for my work for legalization has been in meeting, knowing, and working with the incredible souls and spirits who I've been privileged to come in contact with over these past years. I consider this work a living document, and I invite anyone who has a correction, a recollection, or an event that they think should be mentioned in future editions to contact me. Over time, just like Hempfest, this historical document will grow and evolve with all of our collective contributions. Chapter 0, The Seed. Activism springs from an intentional action to bring about social, political, economic, or environmental change. 20 years ago, when a small group of activists attended a community peace concert decided to throw a humble salvo at the United States war machine, something happened. From that initial political statement, a protest phenomenon would spring forth, a clarion call for freedom and equality that would eventually be heard around the world. The Iraq military had just invaded the nation of Kuwait, the Soviet Union was disintegrating, and a local band named Nirvana was being signed to Geffen, a major record label. I was a community activist living in Seattle, having founded an all-volunteer street-level community action group, the Seattle Peace Heathens, a few years earlier. I had been participating in an annual summer series of musical performances that to this day alternates between various parks in the city called the Seattle Peace Concerts. The Peace Concert series was initiated in the 1980s by the Love Israel family, a spiritual group led by a charismatic fellow named Loved Israel. Called simply the Love Family, by the early 90s the group had relocated to an Arlington, Washington property where they lived semi-communally for several decades. By the late 1980s, a free outdoor urban concert series had been picked up by former Love Family member Don Glenn. The Seattle Peace Concerts is a community-based project that affords unsigned bands an opportunity to perform to an audience that, during the 90s, ranged from hundreds to several thousand at a time. The concert series was well intended in those days, and many great Seattle acts routinely performed for free. Alice in Chains' 1990 album Facelift had just been released days before. That album would catapult the Seattle-based band into mega stardom. But the Peace Concert featured bands that played on the tavern circuit where bands like Alice in Chains had gotten their start. The August 26th concert was the last of the annual series, and it took place on a clear, sunny Seattle day. The concert featured the Kathy Hart Band with Tom McFarlane, the Wombats, and Jerry Miller, legendary Grape, formerly of Moby Grape. Summer was ending, and almost everybody knew that America was poised to go to war. Earlier that August, the Iraqi army had launched an invasion of Kuwait, with 4 elite Iraqi Republican Guard divisions rushing into the oil-rich Arab nation. It was the right political environment for a peace concert. The event was at Gasworks Park, a 19-acre public park that was formerly a coal gasification plant operated by the Seattle Light Company. Gasworks Park sits nestled on the waterfront of Lake Union, on the south end of the Wallingford district. Once heavily polluted, the park was eventually topped off by a clay cap several feet thick that was covered densely with sod. The large metal holding towers still stand, their rusty catwalks twisting and turning around the hulking fenced-off cylindrical structures. At the August concert, some community activists from the Seattle Portable Outdoor Theater, a Rainbow Family guerrilla theater group, had erected a huge rainbow-striped canvas tent in the middle of the park. It was a handmade Bedouin-style canopy that serves as a performance stage at the annual National Rainbow Gatherings. As the late-day sunshine streaked low across the horizon, Peace Concert organizer Don Glenn remarked about the irony of holding a concert for peace while America was about to embark upon war. When the President of the United States is undermining peace in the world, it's pretty hard to hold a celebration for peace, Glenn said to the crowd. We should stay right here until we can hold a real peace concert, he continued. His words prompted a large handful of participants to spend the night in the bright canvas tent to protest American aggression in the Middle East. The group decided it was going to hold a political occupation at Gasworks Park until America had no military presence in Iraq or Kuwait. I was among those staying behind. After the first night in that tent, it became apparent that we would need to find another location for sleeping, as the Parks Department security people had arrived with a huge tow truck promising to tear down our sacred structure, which contained our possessions. We decided to move inside the large covered gasworks structure. That worked well for a while until city authorities threatened to cite everyone for trespassing. That's when a house was rented across the street where vigil goers could bathe and legally sleep. It was called the Vigil House and acted as a flop house for the various activists, drifters, and the generally socially disenchanted people who made up the majority of the peace vigil's ranks. Calling ourselves Peacework Park, Peace Vigil, this ad hoc political action went on to last 6 months and eventually included hundreds of people. Notable cultural icons including Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg attended the vigil at Gasworks, as well as the future Washington Governor Mike Lowry. The Peace Vigil became the site for rallies, teach-ins, and other community events. As many as 5,000 people attended the largest peace rally there. A large candle wax altar on a piece of plywood constantly burned, tucked into the gasworks structure in a low area protected from the wind. There was running water, sinks, and fire pits. For a solid 6 months, keepers of the vigil were present at that altar 24 hours a day. There were undoubtedly a few times in the middle of the night that folks may have drifted off to sleep, but it was a vigilant sleep, I assure you. The biggest problem that we had at that action were people being intoxicated. Witnessing the problems that we had at the vigil with alcohol had a big impact on me. I decided at that time that events that I organized were going to be alcohol-free. During this time, someone scheduled a startup meeting for a statewide chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, or NORML. It was at that outdoor meeting that Hempfest was conceived. I was at that meeting, as was a fellow I did not know yet named Gary Cook. Gary had been dissatisfied with the momentum of the informal gathering of potential pot activists, and he decided that he wanted to produce an event that would promote cannabis awareness and involve more members of the community. He wanted to educate the attendees on the truth about the cannabis plant. Gary had experience as a producer of punk rock shows in Eugene, Oregon during the 80s. Apparently everyone Gary talked to about his ideas suggested that he contact me, as I was very high profile at that time and involved in benefit shows, rallies, and demonstrations as an MC and organizer. I'd been operating the Seattle Peace Heathens for several years. I had founded the Seattle Peace Heathens in 1988 with a vision to engage other alternative culture youths and alternative culture folks in community service, volunteerism, and general positive activity. Targeting street-level youth and homeless people, the Peace Heathens had many projects aimed at benefiting the community. The longest-lasting project is the Seattle Crisis Guide, which can still be found at seattlecrisis.org. During this time, I was working as a waiter at the Last Exit on Brooklyn, Seattle's oldest coffee house, and the central meeting place for a vast community of Seattle's diversity. Called simply the Exit, or the ZIT, the brick building was one large square room located just blocks away from the University of Washington campus. The Exit was opened in 1967 by the lovingly cantankerous Irv Siskey, who operated the trendy hangout until his death in the early 1990s. The wallpaper, hanging on those walls since the Exit opened, had since been stained a rusty brown by thick layers of cigarette smoke from over the years. Poets, peaceniks, and panhandlers all vied for a spot at one of the tables as the place was always packed. There were square marble slab tables along the walls of the room that were said to have been stall dividers from the restrooms of the old King County Courthouse. In the center of the room were large round wooden tables reported to have been former card tables once used in a casino. People played Go and chess on the tables, backgammon was banned, and wandered up and out on the outside deck when the weather was nice. The last Exit was a hub for bohemians in Seattle, and every Monday night was music, an open music night. The place would be filled to capacity, standing room only, and there would be a microphone stand set up in the middle of the place, large PA speakers hanging from the ceiling, and incredible performances took place there, as musicians would come from all over to sign up for a slot. The Last Exit served as my office because my waiter job there allowed me to network with all the other activist types who came through its busy doors. I would have my organizer friends sit in my section, and then I could go from table to table and network while I was taking orders for coffee and bran muffins. Seattle had a thriving live music scene as the advent of grunge music had resulted in an explosion of live clubs. I was the singer in a rock band called Stickerbush, which had played many of the same clubs where these alternative bands became established. I was always walking the streets of Seattle, postering light poles and telephone poles with flyers promoting Peace Heathens events and Stickerbush shows. Gary tracked me down and shared his vision of a public event that promoted cannabis reform and education. Gary had just gotten a hold of a copy of Jack Herer's groundbreaking book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. We were very excited to discover how much we didn't know about the history of the cannabis plant and its rich resources. I suggested Volunteer Park to Gary as a good location for our first event. The Peace Heathens had a handful of bulky handheld CB radios at that time, and I offered the group services for security. Gary contracted a friend, Seattle musician Neil Storm, who was able to scrape together a patchwork PA system. Gary created the promotional poster for the first Hempfest using rub-on letters. The crude but effective poster advertised the Washington Hemp Expo, Alternative Resource and Energy Fair. Members of the Peace Heathens got busy putting up posters on Seattle's heavily laden telephone and light poles. In those grunge days, some telephone poles in the city were 7 to 8 inches thick with paper posters promoting rock shows. The Peace Heathens peace heathens knew how to hang posters, and with the help of other organizers, we managed to plaster the city with posters announcing the controversial new event. The rest is, as we like to say, hempstery. It's a picture of that first rub-on letter poster. 1991, The Roots, Chapter 1. Seattle's Volunteer Park sits nestled above the Capitol Hill neighborhood, an affluent, albeit culturally avant-garde community that's perched overlooking the Interstate 5 corridor that runs through the heart of downtown Seattle. Acquired in 1876 by the city of Seattle for a mere $2,000, it was originally intended to be a cemetery, but it was instead named Lakeview Park, and the cemetery was created on an adjacent area of land. The community land was dedicated to volunteers who had served in the Spanish-American War. The sprawling park includes an impressive glass conservatory, a Victorian greenhouse modeled after London's Crystal Palace, a water tower replete with an observation deck, an enclosed reservoir, an Art Deco building that's now the Seattle Asian Art Museum, a statue of William H. Seward, and a sculpture called Black Sun by Osamu Noguchi. That sculpture became the inspiration for the famous Soundgarden song Black Hole Sun, released in 1994. Near the statue is a cement amphitheater crowned by cedar, pine, sequoia, and madrone trees that ring the outer edge of the park's natural grassy bowl. Promoted as Washington Hemp Expo 91, the first Hempfest took place on August 17, 1991. We drove our vehicles up into the wooded area behind the amphitheater, which has a high brick wall built around the back side of it to project sound toward the audience. When we arrived in the morning, we were concerned that there were more homeless people sleeping in the park than usual. The sound gear came in as the morning progressed, and one by one the homeless people woke up to the early sun and approached the stage. That's when we realized that these people were not homeless at all. They had traveled from other places to attend the rally. A few fellows informed us that they had driven from other states just to be there. We began to realize that we were embarking upon a path of activity that had a lot of popular support. Within a few hours, there were hundreds of people milling about on blankets and lawn chairs or just sitting on the freshly mowed grass. I took my place at the microphone and prepared to MC the kickoff Hempfest event. The keynote speaker for the first Seattle Hempfest was Jack Herer, the author of the hemp activist Bible, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. Gary had contacted Jack, whose collection of heavily researched factoids, news clippings, and editorial rants, first published in 1985, had already started a political grass fire. Herer had begun collecting information about the cannabis plant and its uses as far back as 1973, spurred on by the life and struggles of his friend Captain Ed Adair, about whom he writes in the book. Subtitled, The Historical Record of Cannabis and of the Conspiracy Against Marijuana and How Hemp Can Save the World, The Emperor Wears No Clothes reveals the rich global history that the cannabis hemp plant has enjoyed throughout the advent of modern man. Herer gave a speech that was explosive. Hemp will save the planet, he insisted. In 5,000 years of human consumption, not a single person has ever died from cannabis. The crowd roared. It was unusual to see anyone speaking publicly about ganja, but this guy was saying things nobody had ever heard before. When the event was over, I made sure that the Peace Heathens' ethic of leave no trace was enforced, as I knew how critical it was for us to leave the park as clean or cleaner than we found it. Americans had endured decades of disinformation about pot smokers, which had long fomented a reputation for stoners as being lazy and irresponsible deadbeats. I knew we had to do everything we could to counter those preconceived notions about us. Thus began a Seattle Hempfest tradition of picking up every stitch of litter in the parks that's been generated by the event. We estimate that in 20 years of Hempfest, we picked up over 1 million cigarette butts. Once the cleanup was done and we had a chance to reflect, we were incredibly bolstered by the success of that first Hempfest. People were so eager, so hungry for a way to express their passion for legalization, and many folks told us that Seattle Hempfest was exactly what they had been looking for. Time for maybe just a couple more here. 1992, The Sprout, Chapter 2. A little over a month before the 1992 Hempfest, Bill Clinton was elected President of the United States after saying that he never inhaled when he had smoked pot in college. As silly as his statement was, my colleagues and I were pleased that the new president was a former pot smoker. Earlier that year, Nirvana's Nevermind album went to #1 on the U.S. Billboard 200 chart, and the local music scene exploded with young musicians flocking to Seattle in droves, and performance clubs cropping up all over the city. Some of those folks had never worn a flannel shirt before, and Kurt Cobain's attire had young fans scouring thrift shops for old sweaters to complement their new shaggy hairstyles. I was much younger and even more radical than I am today. In those days, I swore on stage, and I was largely disconnected on how my words could impact others or the general pop movement. That would change over time as my awareness and sensitivity to these issues grew. I recall one of my slogans, "The New World Order has an old world odor," was one actually coined by the amazing songwriter Jim Page. Jim has actually since told me that he got that from me, so I think I might have made it up myself, but I was mistaken on that. Hempfest was a very underground, under-the-radar event, and I was oblivious to any long-term ramifications of the words I set up on that stage. We had no idea that Hempfest would be anything more than a flash in the pan. I had little concern with mixing political issues, and I had yet to really understand the potential our words had up there for moving minds. I had not yet advanced to a point where I was sensitive to the power and impact that our fledgling protest event would come to wield. We were operating mostly on intuition from a sincere desire to raise awareness about the incredibly resourceful cannabis plant. Over the years, I developed a much deeper sensitivity to the subtleties involved in public advocacy. That stuff would come from trial and error. When the day finally came around for the second Seattle Hempfest, the weather was terrific. The sun shone down and there was almost no wind. Our crew had already thrown down a Hempfest event, and the setup and preparations went more smoothly this time. In addition to being the master of ceremonies, I also got to perform as Stickerbush, the band I was in at the time, played at the second Hempfest. Headlining the event was Bam Bam, a local rock fusion band headed up by guitarist Tommy Martin, who still provides sound for the Hempfest Symposium stage, a huge tent where speakers, panels, keynote presentations, and music takes place. Also on the bill was the renowned Seattle reggae act Ganja Farmers, an extremely heavy stoner band aptly named Seed. As soon as the rally started, I noticed the crowd going crazy at something that appeared to be happening behind me. I turned around to see my two colleagues bringing up two large budding sinsemilla plants onto the stage. Later, I joked to Gary, "No wonder you wanted me to MC the event. You guys are crazy." The mostly long-haired male rockers who comprised much of the crowd of roughly 800 people were absolutely delighted to see those shining examples of nature's finest work on display for all to see. At the end of the event, nobody from Hempfest had the courage to load those two pot plants into their car and drive away. I can't say what we did with them, but I can say that it was a lot of fun. I will say that we broke them up in little pieces and threw them out to the crowd. I was just not willing to put that on paper. We were aware of no police presence, but we were certainly aware that the distinct sweet odor of burning marijuana was there all day long. We had successfully pulled off another legalization rally, and this time we estimated that we had a total crowd of over 2,000 people. Elated, we had pushed the envelope even further, and we were apparently still free men. Life was good. And my last, maybe I can squeeze two of these tiny little chapters in, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. 1993, Chapter 3, The Awakening. Our once sleepy Pacific Northwest city had apparently developed insomnia, as Sleepless in Seattle was the big motion picture of 1993, and it seemed that our town had been discovered by a media hungry to promote a new pop music mecca. An evolving punk metal hybrid genre of music had been previously coined grunge by Green River and Mudhoney musician Mark Arm, and Nirvana and Pearl Jam's first albums had catapulted the genre into a mainstream music phenomenon. Gone were the bigger the hair, the closer to God. Gone were the bigger the hair, the closer to God hairstyles, and a much more natural, casual look took hold within the youth music culture as the Seattle style of denim, flannel, and leather was emulated by throngs of music fans all over. This trend was evident at the 1993 Hempfest, as the audience was primarily comprised of young, long-haired, motorcycle-jacketed males, and the event was even more over the top than the previous fests. Salamander, Dandelion Soup, and the Ganja Farmers rocked the crowd. Eager to outdo the wild antics of previous years, my comrades emerged from the backstage area with more budding sinsemilla plants. This time they also placed 8 small plastic bongs on the front of the stage, accompanied by 8/8 of green bud. The first and last Seattle Hempfest Bongathon took place before the cheering approval of the audience. After inviting 8 brave volunteers from the crowd, we set out to see who could smoke their 8th of pot the fastest. I recall that the fellow who won was moderately excited to find out that he had just won the 8th of pot he had already smoked. Gary says there was an additional prize, but that's not how I recall the event, which I barely recall. But it was definitely a day to slightly remember. This particular Hempfest was in great part produced by our brother Christofari, who had been performing personal research on the cannabis plant for many years. Neil Storm had contacted some friends at American Music and secured a more adequate sound system than the one we had the first few years, and we were on our way to bigger and better things. Last chapter I'm going to read is The Arrival. 1994, and that is chapter 4. The third Hempfest at Volunteer Park had been a success, but we knew we had taken the small amphitheater to its maximum capacity. A more suitable venue was needed for our growing protest rally. It was decided that we'd go back to the place of Hempfest's inception, Gasworks Park. Word was getting out that there was a new annual event in town that was boldly telling the unvarnished truth about the insanity of America's pot laws. Alice in Chains had recently released their Jar of Flies album, which debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts, something no EP had ever accomplished. Seattle was on the top of the world, and the club scene reinforced that notion as there were ample live music clubs for burgeoning music acts to play. Everybody we knew was starting a band. We went to our friend at Seattle Parks Department, George Long, for a permit to hold Hempfest at Gasworks Park. George was a large man with a deep voice and a small ponytail capping off his balding head. A secret supporter of the cause and an old deadhead. George, more than once, George and I had shared more than stories as we crossed paths outside his work environment. "Now, don't you guys get me in trouble over this," I recalled George saying. "Trouble? What trouble?" we innocently replied. We had no trouble lining up acts for that year's Hempfest. Stickerbush, the band I fronted for, performed again that year. The experience of being the MC and also performing a set of songs was so draining that I vowed never to do it again, and I haven't. The Herbivores played, fronted by the dreadlock Jim Matheson. The rock reggae band featured Jay Roberts on guitar, son of the late jazz great master Howard Roberts, and Jim's partner Cher Parker on bass. I think that was their second time performing at Hempfest, and they would eventually go on to become the Seattle Hempfest Band, which still stands today. My good friend Larry Steiner's band, El Steiner, played on the large scaffold stage that we'd erected on the asphalt blacktop in front of the old Gasworks refinery structures that the Peace Vigil had occupied a few years earlier. Outrageous, flamboyant, the high-energy Larry danced like a madman and screamed like a banshee on stage. Larry would go to dance professionally for the band Sky Cries Mary eventually. Seattle's Dandelion Soup played, as did an ad hoc all-star group headed up by the singer of Green Apple Quickstep, Tyler Ty Willman. I simply cannot recall what they called themselves that day, as they were a surprise act and was not included on the poster. I've since researched they were called Mai Tai Water. This ended up being Hempfest last year without a mosh pit barrier in front of the stage. Our headline act of '94 would reveal to us the sheer power that our audience possessed. The bombastic female punk band 7 Year Bitch headlined that year. And I remember the lead singer, Celine Vigil, poking her head out of Larry Steiner's outrageously painted milk van, which served as the backstage green room that year, and remarking, "Jesus Christ, look at all the people out there." We were totally unprepared for the throngs that came. There was a sea of humanity in every direction as the hot sun streaked into Gasworks Park that day. The gridlock on the streets of the surrounding neighborhoods was intense. Residents coming home from their daily commute were unable to find parking in their neighborhood, that is, if they could even make it that far in the backed-up Hempfest traffic. There were simply people everywhere trying to get into the event. Up on stage, 7 Year Bitch roared ferociously. There were stage-diving youths attempting to springboard into the crowd from the stage edge. I had to go up to the front along with other volunteers to protect the sovereignty of the stage, which had a raging mosh pit in front of it. One guy made it past us and up onto the stage, and as he went to jump into the crowd, his foot pushed into the protective screen covering one of the monitor speakers, essentially destroying it. I positioned myself carefully and started untying the shoelaces of anyone the crowd was trying to pass up on stage. For a while, this tactic worked fairly well, as the stage divers tried to either tie their shoes or retrieve them from the center of the pit. At one point, we realized that the surface of the scaffold stage was rocking back and forth. I looked down to see people in the front of the audience holding onto the edges of the plywood that was laid down as flooring. They were rocking the stage up and down several inches. I remember a growing feeling of alarm. If they had wanted to, the crowd probably possessed the ability to turn the entire thing up on its end. At one point in the performance, a fight broke out. The band stopped and I took the mic and verbally admonished the dudes fighting. "Hey man, you guys fighting down there. This is community here. Why are you fighting at our community event? We have to learn to work together if we're going to ever end prohibition. Please respect that by not fighting." The crowd applauded and cheered, and the two fighters gently assimilated back into the crowd. Also during the show, someone started to set up a Marlboro tent in the park, presumably to promote the cigarette brand. Gary was enraged. He ran down to the booth and started screaming, "No way are you setting this booth up at our event. You're not promoting cigarettes at Seattle Hempfest." The perpetrator of the tobacco booth sheepishly dismantled it and it disappeared into the pot smoke haze of the crowd. At 4:20 p.m. at Hempfest that year was the first time we really experienced what we now call the 420 fog rolling into our event. It looked as if the entire audience was on fire. because there was a thick cloud of cannabis smoke hovering over the entire girth of the venue. Also at 420 Hempfest that year, Jack Harris spoke to the audience, who learned how industrial hemp had been grown by several of America's forefathers, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. In those days, Harris was energized, and his passionate speeches were equal parts history lesson and call to action. Intensely focused, Jack was an unusual character, and he would talk to anyone willing to listen about the multifaceted cannabis plant. That year drew an estimated 15,000 people, and as the event grew exponentially in size and notoriety, the cost of production and promotion grew as well. Gary had a huge banner made that was attached to the rear of a small plane that flew around the city promoting Hempfest in the days prior to the event and during. The need for a larger sound system, scaffold staging, and handheld radios meant we needed to generate more income for Hempfest. We began a series of benefit shows, many of them taking place in the same clubs that had propelled the famous grunge music acts of the era. Seattle clubs like the Ditto, the Crocodile Cafe, Rock Candy, the Off Ramp, and the OK Hotel all opened their doors to help raise green energy for the cause. In the years that have followed, hundreds of Northwest bands have contributed to the fest, playing gigs for free, without any promise of playing the big kahuna. That was the first year we had staff shirts. In '94, we picked up the graphic design work of Jamie Sheen and Art Chantry. They collaborated on our famous '94 cigarette pack poster, produced both on hemp paper as well as on 100% hemp burlap. The poster was the first of many designed by this team to win national awards for art design and creativity. The '94 cigarette poster won an Art Directors Award, a Summit Award, and a hemp burlap poster version is hanging in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio. After Hempfest was over, I was walking under the large concrete arches that used to hold a large coal chute back when the park was a petroleum refinery. Some fellow began yelling at me to wait for him. I stopped, and this guy I'd never seen before came running up to me. "Dude, I'm from Texas, and I just decided to walk down to the park today. Dude, we have nothing like this where I come from," he said. "You guys are the shit. Here, I want you to have this. I want you to have my Dallas Cowboys baseball cap. It's my prized possession, and I want you to take it." The cap was very soiled. I tried to explain that I was very grateful, but I was not really a big spectator sports fan. But he insisted that I take it. I still have that baseball cap. And there's an insert here from Art Chantry, and I'll read that. This version of the 1994 poster, Jamie and I decided was a silk screened on hemp burlap with a slight design change. The leaf is reversed to allow the burlap texture to show through. Jamie had a client that was pioneering hemp products in America, and through him she met Vivian. That's how the connection to Hempfest was made for her and then me. The burlap version was to promote the idea that hemp is not just about smoking. As Hare reminded us all, hemp used to be the primary fiber source in the world until the chemical industry went to war against the hemp competition. Art Chantry. Art is really one of the most famous living poster artists of the post-1960s era, and it's really been a pleasure to work with him. This year, the Hempfest poster being designed by Ernie Sheffalou, who's designed about 20 famous album covers from Black Sabbath to the Bee Gees, and he also is one of the creator of the Rolling Stone lips. So we're pretty excited to work with him, and we're expanding to a Hempfest business show as well, business show at the Seattle Center during Hempfest this year, so we're pretty excited. Thank you all for coming. I had 30 days to write this book. You know, I was originally complaining to my friend and colleague Todd McCormick on the phone, saying, "Man, you know, I'm working 12 hours a day in Hempfest. I don't know how to pay my rent. I'm so broke. You don't know what I'm going to do." And he's like, "Maybe you need to write a book." I'm like, "A book?" He says, "Yeah, man, you need to write a book about Hempfest, you know." And I got my publisher, you know, I'll talk to him. Maybe we could help you out. So he hooked me up with this publisher, and we kind of talked about it. And he says, yeah, it's a great idea. Let's do it. And this is about 2.5 months before Hempfest. And he's like, "Yeah, it's got to be done in 30 days. I'm like, "What?" I thought, you know, spend a year researching the book, you know, and a year writing. And he's like, "Oh, yeah, it's got to be done in 30 days. We can have ready to sell at Hempfest, and then we'll figure out the pictures." And I'm like, "Dude, we're 2 months from Hempfest. That's the physical impossibility. I mean, you don't even know what you're asking me. Are you crazy? I can't do it. Sorry." I hung up the phone. I started thinking about it. Man, this is an opportunity, you know. First of all, chance to tell the story of Hempfest, chance to pay my rent. Offered me, you know, a deal. You know, I really can't pass this up. So I called him up. I called him back. "I'll do it. I'll write the book in 30 days. Man, I feel sorry for my lady Conti, because I was really not fun to be around for those 30 days. Because we're in full promotion mode with Hempfest, which is already a full-length anxiety attack, never stops. And I had no time for research. I had no time for interviews. I had no time fact checking or anything like that. So this is really came right out of my memory banks. And then spent about 2 weeks kind of pulling all the pictures together and trying to figure out how to find high-res versions of all these thousands of pictures that we'd had and stuff. And I just feel so fortunate because not everybody has a story to tell, and of those people that do, very few people have an opportunity to share it with folks. There's a few minutes, so I want to kind of just open up and see if anybody has any questions or comments. Yeah.
Have you noticed a change between the pre-initiative Hempfest and the post-initiative Hempfest?
That's a great question. There hasn't been a demonstrable change because we acted like pot was legal at Hempfest from the very first day. So, you know, there was a big, the city government was extremely concerned that when I-502 passed, that Hempfest was going to have another 20, 30,000 people. And frankly, it's actually been slightly less attendance. You know, there's a lot of factors to that. But we haven't really noticed a big change. We have done some changes. We have worked with Dr. Roger Rothman of the University of Washington School of Social Work Marijuana Treatment Project to put together a series of 8 cards that we call the Cannabis Gut Check cards. And they're mostly geared towards youth, but they're geared towards anybody dealing with marijuana and driving, cannabis and your lungs, cannabis in your brain, cannabis and addiction, cannabis in teens, things like that. Feeling that now that pot's legal, we have to really ramp up the awareness and the education on, you know, the potential dangers and other aspects that people should know about. And we worked last year to institute 2 21 and over smoking areas inside of Hempfest that were fenced off, out of public view, where people 20 and over could go in and really smoke legally in a public park, which is something nobody's ever done before in America that I'm aware of, because the city signed off on it. And so we've changed a few things, but Hempfest itself really hasn't changed much since I-502 passed. And as we're seeing, as things work out, that there's just as much a need for, it's just as relevant today as the problems of I-502 and the conflicts between medical marijuana. And then, of course, you know, I've had several people say, so Hempfest is over, right? You know, there's no need to do it anymore. I was like, excuse me, you know. 29 grams is still a misdemeanor, 40 grams still a felony. You can't grow any plants, and there's 46 states where it's still illegal.
What's the attendance like over the last couple of years? Has it increased? And what's the numbers? Do you know the numbers?
Well, you know, the city counted, we counted everybody at Hempfest last year, and the count came out to 106,000. Whether you can have a minimum wage security person sitting there with a deal and being able to actually accurately count the people coming and going is really questionable. I don't think anybody really knows. Maybe the Akashic Record knows how many people are at Hempfest, but a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I was very briefly a volunteer, and one thing that was very interesting to me about Hempfest was suddenly it became not just a long-haired male in leather jacket thing, but a family thing. People were bringing their babies in strollers, their kids, and, you know, whole families, and I just thought that was stunning and a really good development. So I wonder if you could say something about that.
Sure. About 8 years ago, a writer in The Stranger said that Hempfest was a patchouli-stained ghetto, and that it was littered with tie-dyes and prayer flags, and that we were holding back the movement. And if we really wanted to be taken seriously, we would ban the tie-dyes and the prayer flags. And at the time, I thought that was tremendously an unfair characterization of Hempfest, because you look at any photo of the crowd, and 80 to 90% of the people in our crowd are completely mainstream looking. It's just that the freaky people tend to stick out a lot. But it's true, over the years, Hempfest has really changed in its demographic, and there's a lot of people my age, a lot of people pushing 60 there or older, people from all walks of life, a lot of people bringing their kids, too many people bringing their dogs. And you know, we've been approached by all kinds of people. Hey, we've got these big, huge, puffy children things that people, you know, we have a children's area we can bring in, we can do all this stuff. We've always avoided all that. While we allow people to bring their kids because it's a free speech event, we can't deny anybody, we don't do anything to encourage people to bring their children there. I think that would be in poor taste for a variety of reasons. The other thing about it is, speaking of people's age, is we're uncomfortable with the amount of youth that are smoking openly there, the amount of really young folks. And that's a challenge for us to deal with that, and we're working hard as we can to try to, I think the most effective thing is just try to educate people so that they make their own decision. But that's a challenging thing. It's probably our political Achilles heel, is the youth that are there being exposed to smoking or engaging in it. Allison?
I was curious about the peace heathens and the current status of the peace heathens. And
It's a great question.
what
The
you
pizza
think.
havens.
Yeah.
You know, originally the Hempfest was a project that the Peace Heathens worked on about 2 months out of the year, which means putting up flyers basically and then running the event and then cleaning it up. And then the Hempfest grew and it got to a point where there was 2 months of the year we didn't work on Hempfest. And now, as you know, Hempfest is full bore, 150 weeks or through an entire year. And the Peace Heathens kind of got absorbed. The Hempfest just grew so large, so omnipotent, so overwhelming that the Peace Heathens have kind of been sucked into the Hempfest, absorbed into the beast. But that said, we still maintain the crisis guide at seattlecrisis.org. It's a big challenge to update and fact check that stuff because Hempfest requires, thousands and thousands of volunteer hours. But the Peace Heathens really exists in spirit inside the body of the Hempfest now. And it's probably about time to have some kind of Peace Heathen reunion thing, because I think we are at Hempfest, Peace Heathen started in 1988, so we're getting close to a 30-year reunion here coming up soon. Anything else?
Yeah, thank you for Hempfest.
Have you, along those lines, have you been contacted by organizers in other states to put together Hempfest?
Such a relevant, timely question. We have been contacted over the years multiple times. We have assisted many, many events. We've given, legal advice on permitting, physical advice, sent volunteers, MCs to a lot of events. And we actually just started a licensing program right now, and we've licensed for SoCal Hempfest. We're talking to Salem Hempfest right now, Las Vegas Hempfest. So we're actually, yes, we're working with many, many events, and we actually have a licensing agreement for events that want to call themselves Hempfest that are going to keep the community values, the political content, voter registration. They got to have first aid. We have a whole list of quality requirements. You can't copyright it, but about a year ago, we got contacted by 2 women in the Virgin Islands saying that their former business partner was trying to copyright the name Hempfest to rip us off specifically, to charge us for it and deny us the use of it. We found out that he used our logos and our artwork he sent to trademark it for his thing, which alarmed us greatly. And so we have started the process of trademarking the event ourselves, which is a very lengthy and complicated process for something like that. Hempfest, Seattle Hempfest has almost become a word like festival. You can't trademark festival. You could trademark this festival, but not just festival. And so, we're working through right now trying to trademark and protect our brand. There's been Hempfests calling themselves Hempfest, having wet T-shirt contests and just doing stuff that we think is not in the best interest of a community reform event, things that are distracting and not a good mix, and doing them irresponsibly and even recklessly by not having any kind of first aid, not having water, things like that. And so yes, we've been working for a long time, and we'll help any pot event, any reform event that we think is going to be done in a responsible way. But it's got to have this community values component that we think has made Hempfest so successful all this time. We believe that we have the right to use public property to air our grievances and our First Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights to speak and gather, but we don't have a right to trash the parks. We don't have a right to, deny other people their free speech or their livelihood, things like that. It's been a complicated balance because not all of the businesses down on the waterfront enjoy Hempfest happening there. And so it's a year-long permitting process every year. The permit takes a year to secure. It's really a yoga. But yes, the short answer is yes. We've helped out a lot of other events, and we want them to spring. And they're springing up like all over the place. Some of them are just a desire to extract revenue and exploit this kind of new industry, and some of them are sincere events to educate and reform and create community awareness.
Have you found big differences in the way the city of Seattle has handled your permit requests from one administration to another?
Not really. Sometimes you're never really sure where stuff's coming from. You know, it's easy to be paranoid when you're using something like this. A lot of times I think that we felt they're out to get us. It's just bureaucracy and red tape and stuff like that. Ironically, we've learned that if we really want to know what's going on behind the scenes with our event, we have to do a Freedom of Information Act request for documents to the city. And we just did that, and we found all kinds of stuff, you know, all kinds of complaints that we didn't know about, and issues coming from over here and there. And we find out, you know, what's being said about us. It's actually very enlightening. And I don't think they're trying to keep stuff from us. I think it's just bureaucracy and time management. And you know, these guys have huge jobs handling huge events. Hempfest is a gigantic pain in the ass for these people that work on the permitting. And we're the biggest, most complicated, you know, taboo, barely legal, you know, thing. And like they say, it's one of the most loved events in the city, and it's one of the most hated events in the city by people. So it's interesting, but you would not believe the issues and the things that we have to deal with. You know, one time we got an emergency call from, you know, horrible trash and garbage in front of a business, you know, during Hempfest, you know, and they're outraged, and they called the mayor's office and they called the city. So I personally left Hempfest and went down to there onto Elliott Avenue to check it out, and there were 7 French fries. It was 7 French fries in front of their door on the sidewalk. I was like, is this even from Hempfest? You know, it's like a half a mile away. But that's the kind of stuff, you know, sometimes we and you know, if somebody doesn't like you, your garbage looks worse, stinks worse. We actually had the Edgewater last year sent photographs to the city. Here's a picture of a glass pipe that was actually left in one of our elevators. Here's vomit in the parking lot of the Edgewater on the weekend of Hempfest. We're like, you had 6 wedding receptions that weekend. You've got bars, you know. I mean, how do you know it's ours, right? And so, you know, that's the kind of things that we have to deal with. And we try not to take it personally. You know, Hempfest has a huge impact, and we know it. There's only a couple minutes. If anybody wants to purchase a book, I got some over there. I'd be glad to sign some. Last question, I got to hurry up.
Yeah, well, what's in the future for locations of Hempfest? Do you stick into the same place?
You know, we spent about 4 years talking with Seattle Center, where it's not going to work there for a variety of reasons. We don't want to move there. It's not going to work. We've looked at Magazine-Product. We've been as far as the Enumclaw Fairgrounds, and there was nowhere else to hold Hempfest. It's got a multi-criteria of minimal business and residential impact, public transportation, capacity, existing perimeter, parking, and we've just looked everywhere, and there's no. And the city, for the first time last week in a permit meeting, agreed that if we move Hempfest somewhere else, we're going to import all these issues into another community, which is probably less suited to deal with it and is not going to want it. You know, people say, I want you to move to Marymore Park. It's like, man, we have no relation. I think the Highway Patrol, the State Patrol, and the sheriff, you know, is going to like that. You know, we have no good relationship with those sources, those communities. They don't want us, and they don't want us at Redmond. So, I mean, our position is we've got, this is our 20th year in Myrtle Edwards Park. We've never had a serious accident, injury, or arrest there. Pretty good track record. I think we have it wired. They've been very gracious to give me an hour. I don't want to take too much time, so we're quick.
Just real quick, I know that Hempfest is basically run by volunteers. How many volunteers do you have to run this huge event?
We print 1,000 staff shirts every year, and we run out of them.
Wow.
So we know that we run through at least 1,000 people. I figure that's about 600 people getting a shirt and screwing off, about 400 people working their asses off. Some people, you give your shirt, you never see them again. You know. So thank you so much for coming, everybody. I really want to thank the University Bookstore for being so gracious to allow this to happen. I want to, you know, once again, the people that missed it. The Peace Heathens started right across the street in front of Tower Records with a crazy little free table 25 years ago. And so I used to sit there staring across the door at these doors all the time. And Gary, who started the Hempfest for years in the 80s, he used to set up a little table right in front of the U Bookstore, right there on the sidewalk. And he had a hemp lay, a red, white, and blue Uncle Sam hat, and he'd have an infrared clothes. He'd be, sow the seed everywhere! Hemp can save the planet. And I used to see Gary all the time. Right in front of the U Bookstore was his spot where he started. So that's really where Hempfest was founded, was right here. Thank you so much.